Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we are going to be taking a look at East Asian business culture, specifically China. We've got a really fascinating firsthand account from someone who's been there, done that, and has some pretty incredible stories to share about what it's like to try and close a deal on the other side of the world. I think listeners are going to be pretty surprised by just how different things can be.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me about this account was how it really highlighted this stark contrast between that sort of Western, get down to business mentality and the Eastern emphasis on really building genuine connections, like first and foremost.
Yeah. It's almost like two different worlds are colliding.
Yeah.
Because, on the one hand, you've got these Western executives who are used to formal meetings, presentations. You get straight to the point, time is money, let's make a deal. But then in China, it's all about cultivating relationships. It's about building trust. It's about understanding each other on like a personal level before you even think about mentioning contracts.
Yeah, it's like this really intricate dance of building trust, which is something that's often referred to as guangxi in Chinese culture. And, it's more than just like networking. It's really about cultivating this like web of deep reciprocal relationships that go way beyond just sort of simple transactions.
And that's where things get really interesting. Because our source describes this like incredible multi-day ritual that often surrounds Chinese business deals. I mean, we're talking dinners, drinks, karaoke, socializing, you name it. It's part of the game.
And it's interesting because these events are very meticulously orchestrated. It's not just about having a good time, well, I'm sure that's part of it. But the real goal is to kind of gauge character compatibility and start to build those personal connections that are so crucial for like successful business partnerships in that cultural context.
I mean, there's this one anecdote that really stands out where our source is describing going to dinner with a potential business partner. And they end up singing karaoke until like the wee hours of the morning. And this wasn't just some casual hangout. This is like a carefully calculated move to assess each other's personality and see if they were a good fit.
It is. It's a great example of how guanxi plays out in real life. These seemingly casual social interactions are actually very carefully crafted opportunities to kind of observe how someone behaves outside of a formal business setting, how they interact with others, what their values seem to be. It's all part of building that foundation of trust.
And what's interesting is, it's not necessarily about pressuring anyone into like a deal. It's more about establishing a level of comfort and understanding that paves the way for like smoother negotiations down the line. It's like building a bridge of trust before you even start talking about like the specifics of the deal.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's about creating a shared experience, building camaraderie, and ultimately fostering trust. And it's a very different approach to business than what a lot of Westerners might be accustomed to. But it can be incredibly effective in its own right.
So how does someone who's like, new to this culture, how do they navigate these sometimes pretty elaborate rituals, especially if they don't have a lot of experience with them?
Well, that's where adaptability and cultural sensitivity come into play. Our source talks about feeling a bit overwhelmed at first, but they quickly realized that the key was to just observe, listen, and be willing to step outside of their comfort zone.
But let's be real for a sec. I mean, there are some aspects of this culture that could feel a little intense for someone who's not used to it. Our source even mentions some internal conflict over the drinking culture, especially because they were trying to like cut back on alcohol in their personal life.
Yeah, that's a common challenge for a lot of people navigating different cultures. There's this constant tension between wanting to fit in and honor the customs, while also staying true to your own personal values and well-being. And let's face it, alcohol plays a significant role in Chinese business culture.
So how do you handle that? I mean, especially if you're not a big drinker or maybe you're trying to be mindful of your health, do you have to like force yourself to participate in every drinking ritual just to be polite?
Not necessarily. There are ways to navigate these situations gracefully without compromising your personal well-being. Our source actually provides some great tips on how they manage to participate in the cultural rituals while also setting boundaries and taking care of themselves. Like, for example, they found that just being upfront and explaining their personal preferences was often enough. They'd say something like, I'm trying to cut back on alcohol for health reasons, but I'd love to join you for tea or a soft drink.
I mean, that's such a smart approach
Yeah.
because it shows respect for the culture, but it's also you're being true to yourself. And I imagine that kind of honesty and transparency goes a long way in building trust, even if it means like deviating from the norm a little bit.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is our source found that their Chinese counterparts were often quite understanding. and even supportive of their decision. It kind of challenges this assumption that you have to conform to every cultural expectation to be successful. Sometimes being authentic and setting boundaries can actually enhance your credibility and build stronger relationships.
Yeah, that's a really empowering message for anyone who's ever felt pressured to compromise their values in a different cultural setting. Like, you don't have to sacrifice your well-being to fit in. You can find ways to adapt and navigate those situations while still staying true to yourself.
Precisely. It's all about finding that delicate balance between cultural sensitivity and personal integrity. And remember, even within a single culture, there can be a wide range of individual preferences and comfort levels. So what might feel normal to one person could be quite uncomfortable for another.
Yeah, it's almost like a dance, isn't it? Learning to navigate those cultural nuances, reading between the lines, figuring out what's expected versus what's truly important.
It is a great analogy. It's a constant process of learning, adapting, and refining your approach. And the more you expose yourself to different cultures, the more skilled you become at navigating those complexities.
Our source also talks about how they actually use these experiences as an opportunity to reflect on their own relationship with alcohol and actually make some positive changes in their personal life.
That's a really powerful example of how cultural immersion can lead to personal growth. It can force us to confront our own assumptions, biases, and habits. And sometimes those uncomfortable situations can be the catalyst for positive change.
It's so fascinating how they turned a potentially challenging cultural experience into a chance for self-improvement. They didn't just adapt to the culture, they also used it as a mirror to reflect on their own values and goals. It makes you wonder what other hidden gems of wisdom we might uncover when we step outside of our comfort zones and embrace new experiences.
I think that's a key takeaway for our listeners. It's not just about learning the rules of a particular culture, but also about being adaptable, respectful, and open to finding common ground. And who knows, you might even discover something new about yourself along the way.
So as we kind of delve deeper into this fascinating world of East Asian business culture, let's shift our focus to some other key aspects that our source highlights. For instance, they talk about the importance of nonverbal communication in Chinese business settings. Things like eye contact, body language, even the way you exchange business cards can convey a lot of meaning.
That's an excellent point. Westerners tend to be very direct and explicit in their communication, but in many Asian cultures, a lot of meaning is conveyed through subtle cues and nonverbal signals.
Like, for example, our source mentions that maintaining steady eye contact during a conversation can be perceived as aggressive or disrespectful in some Chinese contexts.
Right. It's a common cultural difference that can lead to misunderstandings. In Western cultures, we're often taught to make eye contact as a sign of confidence and engagement. But in some Asian cultures, it can be seen as a challenge or a sign of disrespect, especially when interacting with someone of higher status.
So how do you navigate those subtle nuances without accidentally sending the wrong message?
It's all about being observant and paying attention to the cues around you. Notice how others are behaving and try to mirror their body language and communication style. And if you're ever unsure, it's always best to err on the side of caution and be a little more reserved in your nonverbal communication.
Our source also talks about the significance of gift giving in Chinese business culture, which is something that can be quite tricky to navigate for outsiders.
Gift giving is an integral part of building and maintaining guanxi in China. It's a way of showing respect, expressing gratitude, and strengthening relationships. However, there are certain protocols and etiquette rules surrounding gift giving that are important to be aware of.
For instance, our source mentions that it's considered taboo to give clocks or watches as gifts in China because they're associated with death.
That's right. The word for clock in Chinese sounds very similar to the word for death, so it's considered highly inappropriate to give a clock as a gift. Similarly, certain colors and numbers have symbolic meanings that could be misinterpreted if you're not familiar with the cultural nuances.
It's like there's this whole hidden language of symbolism and meaning embedded within these cultural practices. It really highlights the importance of doing your homework, understanding the cultural context before engaging in any kind of business dealings in a different country.
Absolutely. And it's not just about avoiding faux pas. It's about demonstrating genuine respect and understanding for the culture you're interacting with.
So beyond gift giving and nonverbal cues, what are some other key differences in communication styles that our listeners should be aware of when doing business in China?
Well, one key difference is the level of directness in communication. Westerners tend to be very direct and explicit in their communication, but in many Asian cultures, including China, communication is often more indirect and nuanced.
So what does that look like in practice? Can you give us an example?
Sure. Imagine you're in a negotiation and your Chinese counterpart says something like, "That's a very interesting idea, but it might be difficult to implement." A Westerner might interpret that as a clear rejection, but in a Chinese context, it could simply mean that they need more time to consider the proposal, or that they want to explore alternative options.
So it's important to read between the lines.
Yeah.
And not jump to conclusions based on what you might be used to in your own culture.
Exactly. It's about being patient, listening attentively, and trying to understand the underlying message, rather than just focusing on the literal words being spoken. And remember, silence can also be a powerful form of communication in Chinese culture.
That's so interesting. It makes you realize how much we take our own communication styles for granted, and how easily misunderstandings can arise when we're interacting with people from different cultural backgrounds.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of being mindful of our own communication patterns and being willing to adapt our approach to better suit the cultural context we're in.
Our source also touches on the hierarchical structure of Chinese businesses, which is something that can be quite different from the flatter organizational structures that are common in many Western companies.
That's right. Respect for authority and seniority is deeply ingrained in Chinese culture. And this is reflected in the way businesses are structured and operated. Decisions are often made top-down, and there's a clear chain of command that's important to respect.
So if you're used to a more collaborative, egalitarian work environment, you might need to adjust your approach when working with a Chinese company.
Exactly. It's important to be aware of the hierarchy and to show deference to those in positions of authority. This means addressing them respectfully, using appropriate titles, and being mindful of your tone and body language.
It also means being patient and understanding that decisions might take longer to be made,
Right.
as they need to be approved by multiple levels of management.
That's a good point. Patience is key when doing business in China. Things often move at a slower pace than in Western countries, and it's important to respect that.
It sounds like navigating the nuances of Chinese business culture is like learning a whole new language, with its own set of rules, customs, and etiquette.
It certainly can feel that way, but with a little bit of effort and a willingness to learn, it's definitely possible to build strong, successful relationships with your Chinese counterparts.
I think one of the most valuable insights our source offers is the reminder that these cultural differences, while they might seem daunting at first, are actually a source of incredible richness and opportunity.
I completely agree. It's about embracing those differences, seeing them as a chance to broaden our perspectives and learn new ways of doing things.
It's about building bridges, fostering connections,
Yeah.
and ultimately creating a more collaborative and inclusive global business landscape. It strikes me that the real key to success in any kind of cross-cultural business setting is not just about learning the rules, but also developing a sense of what you might call like cultural intelligence.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's about being able to read the room, understand the unspoken cues, and adapt your behavior in a way that shows respect and builds trust.
Our source really emphasizes that it's not about becoming an expert in every single cultural nuance,
Yeah.
but rather like adopting a mindset of curiosity and openness. It's about being willing to learn, ask questions, and even embrace those inevitable stumbles along the way, as opportunity for growth.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to highlight. Nobody expects you to be like a cultural chameleon, flawlessly blending into every new environment. What matters most is the genuine effort to understand and respect the cultural context that you're in.
It's about being humble, adaptable, and willing to step outside of your comfort zone. And sometimes it's about challenging your own assumptions and recognizing that there are multiple valid ways of doing things.
And what's so fascinating about this firsthand account is that it goes beyond just describing the differences between Eastern and Western business practices. It actually offers some practical advice on how to bridge those differences effectively. For example, our source talks about the importance of finding a cultural liaison, someone who can help you navigate the complexities of the local business environment.
That's a great tip. Having someone who understands the culture, the language, the unspoken rules, can be invaluable, especially when you're first starting out.
Yeah, it's like having a guide in a foreign country. They can help you avoid costly mistakes, navigate tricky situations, and build relationships with the right people.
And it's not just about having like a translator. It's about having someone who can provide cultural insights and context, someone who can explain the why behind the what.
Precisely. It's about understanding the deeper cultural values that drive behavior and decision-making.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into East Asian business culture, I think the most important takeaway is that success in this arena requires more than just business acumen. It demands a blend of cultural sensitivity, interpersonal skills,
Hmm.
and a genuine willingness to learn and adapt.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that the way we do business is not the only way, and that there's immense value in understanding and respecting different approaches.
It's about building bridges, fostering connections, and ultimately creating a more collaborative and inclusive global business landscape.
And it's about remembering that at the end of the day, business is about people. It's about building relationships, establishing trust, and finding ways to work together effectively, regardless of cultural differences.
So as you venture into the world of East Asian business, remember to pack your curiosity, your open-mindedness, and your willingness to embrace the unexpected. It's a journey that might challenge you, surprise you, and ultimately enrich you, both professionally and personally.
Yeah, and who knows? You might even find that the things that initially seem foreign or challenging become the most valuable lessons you learn.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into East Asian business culture. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and feel inspired to continue exploring the diverse and fascinating world of global business. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep those minds open.